That was the title of my talk, Safe Landscapes. So what do we mean by that? There's two things that I'm sort of trying to balance here at the same time. One is improving fire safety and preparedness, because of course as homeowners, residents in these areas, that's one thing we're very concerned about. But the other is protecting the health of neighboring wildlands, because you guys who live in this wildland urban interface area may choose to feel some responsibility towards those wildlands that you're next to as well. So I'll talk about some things that we can do for that. I'm not going to focus on fire ecology tonight, and I'm not a fire ecologist by background. I'm a wildlife biologist primarily. But there's a few things that I can say without doubt, and those are that fire is a natural part of ecosystems. There's plenty of views. There's a lot we could talk about in terms of fire return frequency and what all that means. Not going to get into it tonight. There's absolutely no doubt, however, that fires are going to happen, that fires did happen, and they're going to continue to happen. They can occur at any time of year, even though we think about there being a fire season. We've seen fire seasons changing and expanding, and actually as part of this project, we mapped the fire starts from all of the large wildfires over the past like 50 years, and you know they've occurred in every month out of the year. And maintaining a fire-safe landscape certainly protects your property and your neighbors, but it's more than that too. If there's a wildfire situation, firefighters are going to come out and take some action in those areas, and they may or may not make it to your house. But it's important to make sure that they can work under the safest possible conditions in a dangerous situation. So just a little bit about fire triangles, and hopefully you guys have seen some of this before. But we think about two different kinds of fire triangles, sort of just the physics of fire itself. What does a fire need to burn? It needs fuel, it needs oxygen, and it needs heat and a source of ignition. And when we think about what fire is going to do on the environment, and what can predict the behavior of a fire, we think, again, about fuel, weather, and topography. Well, out of all of these things, we can't really change the, oxygen being in the environment. I mean, you can when you're actually trying to fight a fire. That's part of it. But we're not going to be changing it. The folks in this room, we can't really change the weather. We can't change the topography. There's one thing that we can address, and that is fuel. So the area that we're thinking about is that wildland urban interface area. Oops, sorry. But I can move on from there. But it's essentially, where homes and private property sort of interdigitates with these wildland, more natural areas. And it's not, this nice clean line in Southern California, especially not in these canyon areas. It's really like a little bit here and a little bit here and moving up in this almost amoeba-like form into wildland areas. So what are some of the issues that we think about when we talk about wildland fire? Changes in fire regime. I already mentioned that a little bit, but this is a big topic of research right now, is how our fire regime is going to be changing with climate change. We know there's been a huge change in the amount of human-caused ignition. If we try to look at the historic condition and compare it to today, there's a lot more sources of ignition in the environment. And we can talk about, fire suppression and fuel manipulation and how that's changed fire frequency and fire severity. When we think about fuels management, we can talk about, should we thin? Should we not thin? How should we do it? Well, what that really means for a homeowner's perspective is, how do we think about brush clearance and the effects of brush clearance on wildland areas? And then the thing that I'm really going to focus some time on, sort of the first half of the talk, is invasive species and how that interacts with fire. So all invasive species are non-native, but not all non-native species are invasive. So we're really only concerned about a small subset of species that cause harm, either to the environment, to human health, to economic systems, whether it's agriculture or infrastructure or something like that. It's just this small subset. The last time I saw a really, really good estimate was that, the effects of these species cost about $123 billion a year. That was estimated in 1999. It's more than likely to have gone up since then, especially when we think about, and this is all invasive species, so when we think about things that have been in the news recently with like Asian carp in the Great Lakes or things like that, or certainly, we don't know quite what's going to be coming to the West Coast from Japan, but we're starting to see infrastructure coming full of species we didn't think would survive the trip across the ocean, and they have. So that's going to be an interesting thing to think about, but not going to affect fire issues too much, I wouldn't think. They can be diseases, they can be predators, they can be things that compete with our native species, damage crops, infrastructure, changes in the physical environment. They generally are things that lack natural predators or diseases in their new home. So a plant species may come here, but say an insect that normally would feed on that plant species doesn't make it here at the same time. So they're kind of freed up from any natural control. They might be favored by other ecosystem and climate changes that we see, say air pollution, bringing a lot more nitrogen into the system might favor a lot of our invasive grasses. And they may be working as an exotic system where several species kind of somehow alter the physical environment so that it's better for other species coming from the same area. So that may all just be things that are a little bit of interest. So what are some of the invasive species that we're concerned with? So I'm going to focus on invasive plants in a minute, but I just wanted to bring up a few things that are certainly of concern when we think about fire. Some of the borer beetles that are causing a lot of tree death throughout Southern California. We've got bark beetles that are really affecting pine species, especially at some of the higher elevations. This has been a huge issue around Big Bear and Lake Arrowhead. Golden spotted oak borer, which we're starting to see in San Diego County. It hasn't been found in Los Angeles County yet, but it may be likely to show up here. Emerald ash borer, another species we haven't seen yet in this area, but it's probably coming. And these insects can cause tree death. Once the trees are dead, that's just a whole lot of standing fuel to deal with. And then we have diseases as well, like sudden oak death. And there's some information out there. I think we're going to put some links up on Ryan's website too, if you're interested. What can you do about these species? There's a little diversion from fire safe landscapes, but you can't think about fire here. One of the big issues is don't move firewood. Don't bring firewood in from another area. If you buy firewood, find out what the source of that firewood is and find out if it's been seasoned, but even that may not be reliable. Find out where it's coming from, because these insects can live on that dead wood. They live as little grubby larvae, and then they emerge later and then can affect trees wherever the firewood's been brought to. So buy wood locally when you travel. If you're camping, burn it there or leave it there. Don't bring it home. And then if you see any signs of some of these pests, call me, talk to Ryan. There's folks at the Park Service I think would be interested to, folks in the Ag Commissioner's office, so let us know. Invasive plants, I'm going to spend some more time on. And these are plants from a similar climate that travel well, grow vigorously, and spread aggressively. So essentially, they're weedy species. They're often adapted to really high disturbance, say after a fire or after clearing soil for fire preparation. And they are drought tolerant. So I think that in Southern California, we think, well, drought tolerant, that's great. We want to save water. And that's true, but there are a lot of native drought-tolerant species that can be used. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but realize that if it's something from, say, Australia, South Africa, that doesn't need a lot of water, that's great in the landscape, but that also means it's going to be able to survive when it heads out into wildland areas. So those are some of the things you need to think about if you're trying to put in a water conservation garden. What are some of the problems they cause? Well, they can displace native plants, which reduces the habitat quality for native wildlife. They degrade recreation areas. And then probably the big one for this group is by simply adding biomass, they can increase risk and damage from floods and fires. And just a couple of pictures of that here. I don't have a laser pointer, but in the top left, that's ice plant on a dune. And if you think about dunes, naturally these are sandy, structures that are designed to move with wind. Well, once they're stabilized, they're no longer going to support the same kinds of native species. Over there is a picture of yellow star thistle, and if any of you have encountered yellow star thistle or tocolote, you'll know why that's not nice to have along your trails. It's just darned unpleasant. It's spiky and painful. And the bottom two pictures are both of Arundodonax, or giant cane, and one is this plant actually during a flood, huge clumps of it being ripped out and brought down a stream, taking out bridges, and also covering beaches. And this is, again, covering the beach. If you're not a beach goer, hey, what does that mean to me? But realize, the importance of our beaches and supporting the economy in Southern California is huge. So some of the problems. So getting back to fire a little bit. So some of the issues with fire, they can increase the risk posed by increasing fuel loads. So what I mean by that is these are things that during the spring might germinate and grow and then die back before we actually get into fire season. So we're just creating more fuel. And we're not just creating necessarily more fuel total, we're creating a continuity of the fuel bed, and that's something that a fire needs to spread. So in a natural drier system, we might have some separation between plants, not so much in coastal sage scrub, more in chaparral, certainly in desert environments in Southern California, and we just get these weeds filling it in, so it's just continuous, and that really helps fire spread quickly. Overclearance for fire safety can lead to the spread of invasive plants. And invasive plants, again, can spread to wildlands if you're choosing to plant them in a fire-safe landscape. So the example that I gave of increasing fuel load and continuity, we've certainly seen that in desert areas. We know that brooms can form really dense stands on hillsides where fire can spread quickly, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, but they think that that's something that contributed to the aerial extent of the fire, like 2005, I think it's later than that, around then, in Catalina, which really has a big problem with brooms, and they're becoming a lot more common in a lot of local areas. Dense mounts of thick ground covers like ice plant, ivy, and vinca, you get this nice green layer on the surface and all this dead thatch underneath, and that can really promote fire spread, and it's very difficult to maintain them properly. And then arundo can actually bring fire down to stream beds that might have acted as a fuel break naturally in the past are now actually acting kind of as a fire conduit because of all of this dead cane. Just a picture of that. So what are some of the invasive plants in addition to the ones that I just talked about that we're concerned with in Topanga? Euphorbia terracina, the carnation spurge, is certainly in the last few years become really, really common throughout the Santa Monica Mountains. Periwinkle, which a lot of people have, it's pretty, it's a nice, pretty little purple flower. That really gets into riparian areas especially. Same with Cape ivy. And crimson fountain grass we have a picture of here, and a lot of the bunch-y grasses like pampas grass and jubata grass as well. And those are not only invasive, they're a real fire risk. A couple of others, Peruvian pepper, which is really, really common around here. People have planted it a lot. Blue gum. Those both produce a lot of litter. Italian thistle and tocolote, a couple of the thistles that are common in yellow star thistle as well. And then fennel, which I personally just cannot stand the smell of. So I hate that. Okay, so what are some of the things that you can do? removing them, which is a difficult task, but also just not choosing to plant them in the first place. So if you are planning a big redesign in your garden, if you are planning to take out a lot of things, there's a lot of good resources for alternatives to some of the invasive plants. The Plant Right one is really neat. Some of the others are handouts, and those are great. The Plant Right one was actually put together by the horticulture industry, and it does a really nice job. You can go on the website, you can see the invasive plant that we kind of don't want you to use, and then you can look for things that have the same features, the same growth form, the same colors, so you can still get sort of the design elements that you want. Okay, so we've talked about invasive plants, kind of bring it into fire-safe landscaping here. So, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that this picture is the best fire-safe landscape in the world, but it's kind of what you're hoping for in your own landscape, at least, that, you know, the fire, if there's a fire all around you, your house does not burn. So I know that Steve Quarles, how many people were here last week? Oh, a lot of you were not. Okay. So last week, an old colleague of mine, Steve Quarles, talked about improving fire safety in the structure itself. So things like double-paned windows and, of course, you know, fire-resistant shingles on the roofs and those kinds of things. He's got some great resources, and I encourage you to watch the video of his presentation, but there's also a whole set of resources that you can use for that. I'm more focused on what we do is we move out from the house. But I want you to think about a fire-safe landscape starting at the structure, because what you're trying to do is prevent the spread of fire from the landscape to the structure, okay? And then, you know, he focused on the problems with when embers actually get into the structure itself. So if you think from the landscape in, what happens a lot of times is people do a great job of their sort of brush clearance zone on the outside and not such a great job right near the house. So some of the principles that we can think about with the landscape is really moving vegetation away from the house, making sure vegetation isn't like right under the eaves, making sure that it's away from windows, making sure that you don't choose plants that can really move fire around. And what I'm thinking about here primarily are palms, where you get these like nice flaming arrows going through, you know, getting blown in and breaking through windows. Okay, so moving things away from decks. I'm going to go through this figure in more detail. So again, the whole goal here is to have defensible space. Have a space where when a fire's coming, your home and landscape can withstand fire on its own or provide a space for firefighters to work and defend the property safely and easily, because they're going to be really busy. So maintain at least 100 feet, or in Topanga, fire department's going to require you to do 200 feet or more depending on your slope, I believe. Jay, is that right? Could be. Okay. Okay. So maintain space around the structures to reduce fire ignition, fire spread, and provide a safe zone for firefighters. Really close to the home within the first 30 feet. Think about lean, clean, and green, and beyond that, eliminating fuel ladders. And I'll go over these in more detail too. Beyond that 70 or 170 feet or whatever the zone is, really what you ought to be thinking about beyond that is knowing evacuation routes and knowing safe areas. And here's why. Moving out from beyond that zone, it's just not going to help you. So essentially what we see now is that certainly you have to be concerned about direct flame impingement on the home itself and radiant heat getting in and causing ignition around the home. But in our Santa Ana-driven wildfires, we have an ember storm. And embers can be coming from miles away. So it's not really that zone that further out, 300 feet, another 100 feet or 200 feet or whatever is really going to help you. It's not, and it's going to provide a larger area to maintain and a larger loss of native habitat, depending on, where you're situated. Okay, so in that first zone around the home, we talk about the first 30 feet, but it's really important not just to think about that, but to think about just the first 5 feet. So really, if you can just have no flammable materials in the first 5 feet around the home, that's great. And if you have things like, say, doormats that are, reed doormats or lawn furniture or something like that within the first 5 feet, that can be okay as long as you're prepared to move it either inside or further out before a fire comes, and realize that you need to make plans to have that happen if you're not there, if you're going to ever go on vacation during fire season, which, as I talked about earlier, really could be any time of year. So just remember that you might not be there when this happens. Think about using completely non-flammable materials in this area: gravel, concrete, stone, metal. As you move out a little bit, low ground covers and grasses. Don't store your firewood and propane tanks in this first 30 feet zone. Keep trees trimmed so that the edge of the foliage is 10 feet from the house. Not the trunk, but the actual edge of the foliage. And you can certainly have vegetation within this zone as long as it's spaced apart, because what you're trying to do is, again, get rid of these fuel ladder areas. So in zone 2, you're moving further out. You can really maintain a lot more vegetation as we go further out, but think about things being in small clumps or trees being pruned so that you've got separation, either horizontal or vertical separation between these clumps of vegetation, because that's going to prevent fire from spreading and keep things well maintained. And then beyond that, don't do anything. Okay, so this is just a figure kind of showing you poorly maintained, well maintained, so that you can have kind of a visual thing. We're not talking about getting rid of every single little bit of vegetation. We're talking about, again, separating things. Removing shrubs from right next to the house, thinning trees, pruning trees, and using low ground covers, and you can use mulches as well in there. And then these are the fuel ladders that we're talking about. So it's, as fire's moving along the ground, spreading up into the crowns where you're going to have higher flame lengths and more ember production. That's what you're trying to avoid near your property. So it's, again, the vertical and horizontal separation. Remember to remove vegetation from under eaves or any vines that are growing on decks, things like that. Remove some of the really, really high ember generating things like palms, Italian cypress, pampas grass, and think about replacing things like pines and eucalyptus with less flammable species. And I'll talk a little more about that too. And then conduct reasonable fire hazard reduction. And this is a tricky concept because brush clearance has become, we've used that term for so long. And, it's pretty obvious, right? You want me to do brush clearance? Okay, I'll clear the brush. I mean, that's, it's silly for us to keep having to go out as fire professionals or professional educators and say, no, brush clearance doesn't mean clear the brush. Well, then name it something else. Brush and habitat are not the same things. And clearance doesn't mean selective removal and thinning. And these are concepts we want you to keep in mind. This is important to me as an environmental scientist, as a wildlife scientist, but it should be important to you as well, because taking things down to bare earth, while it might seem expedient in March or April or May, can cause you problems down the road. Because then you've got these really disturbed areas. The disturbed areas are invaded by weedy species, whether they're native or non-native. Weedy things grow quickly, they produce this biomass, and then they die back. And now, instead of just having instead of having a nice area with this separation, you've got a fuel bed again. So, and of course here, living in a canyon, you've got to think about erosion as well, because it's not just fire season. What ends fire season in Southern California? Generally torrential rain. So right after that, you've got to immediately think about erosion issues. So you want to keep plants to hold on to soil and provide environmental and aesthetic benefits. And some of the other things that maintaining vegetation does is it can actually reduce this weedy growth, and it can keep the soil kind of cooler and potentially provide kind of an ember screen too, although that has its pros and cons, I think. So this is really not great. This is a home in here. So these guys spent a bunch of money to clear this brush around this home and then didn't do anything near the home. In an ember-driven storm, this is not going to particularly save this home. It'll keep a flaming front from going straight to it, but generally that's not the issue. These are just other examples of the same thing. And what they've done is not only have they damaged native habitat here, they've just created a maintenance issue for themselves and an erosion hazard. In this picture up here, this arrow is actually pointing to a slump area, a slide area. And this is just to kind of show you, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but this is just, you know, an aerial view. This is actually Santa Clarita. But, you know, if everybody is doing just a little more, a little more, a little more, a little more, we end up talking about thousands and thousands of acres of wild vegetation being lost. Okay, so what should we do? That's what we shouldn't do. What should we do? We should think about using fire-resistant plants, and I'll talk about fire-resistant plant characteristics. Mulch can be used, irrigation in some areas, and maybe avoiding irrigation in some other areas, and using non-combustible hardscape to kind of break things up. So let me go through that. Here's what I'm not going to do. I am not going to give you a list of plant species to plant in your yard, and I will tell you why in a minute. But what I want you to focus on instead is what are the characteristics of plant species that can help you figure out what would be a good plant to use. So things that store water in their leaves or stems and can maintain a high moisture content with limited watering. And realize that in fire season, that's when you're going to be under watering restrictions. That is the dry season. Things that are slow growing with little maintenance needed and that don't produce a lot of dead, fine material. Things that have an open, loose branching form and don't, again, produce a whole lot of vegetation. And these are not only, you know, make these plants more fire resistant, they're going to help you do less work. Things that have low levels of volatile oils or resins are good, and things that aren't weedy and invasive. And then, you know, this might not make the plant fire resistant for the immediate fire, but things you want to look for the long haul are things that have a good root system for controlling erosion. Some of the things to think about when you're choosing plants, and again, one of the reasons that I don't just provide you with a list, any plant except for the metal one in this picture can burn under the right conditions. Fire-resistant plants for Southern California are going to be drought tolerant because you don't want something that relies on you constantly watering it to keep it alive. Ideally, you want something that's going to survive without a lot of water, but you do have to watch for the drought-tolerant plants from other Mediterranean regions in the world because these could be invasive species. And just to point out, I'm not saying that all native plants are fire resistant. They certainly aren't. But you can absolutely have an all-native fire-resistant landscape. There's a lot that are great and have all of these characteristics. Maintenance is a lot more important than plant choice. So it's not just about planting the right species. It's about keeping them healthy. Water can't compensate for poor maintenance. You are going to have to go in and do some work on these plants. And overwatering can be just as bad as underwatering. If you kill the plant, it goes from plant to fuel instantly, okay? So if you think about slow-growing, drought-tolerant plants that have high water content, you get to do less work. I will leave you with, if you're really, really, really dying for a plant list, the LA County Fire Department has a really good one. And it's good because, I mean, it's good in my opinion because it's really extensive. It gives you a lot of choices. As opposed to what I see with a lot of fire departments, there's like 15 plants and 3 of them are invasive. So, and they've done a really nice job too. It's a little bit hard to read, but if you go through, there's really a lot of information about the different plant species in there. They're all in like little codes. And you can go through and find, if you want to, all native plants that have these fire-resistant characteristics there. Okay, so again, just a few of the natives, and I'm fine if you want to use exotics too, as long as they're not invasive. Just some examples. Poverty weed can be a nice ground cover. There's a lot of really pretty flowers, Douglas iris and the coral bells and the sticky monkey flower can be really attractive. Flannel bush and ceanothus, these are California natives. Flannel bush isn't really a Southern California native, but it's something that you could consider using. Same with something like Western redbud. It's not native to Southern California, but it's not invasive either. Coast live oaks are fantastic. And then there's a bunch of others that you can use too. So what makes a highly flammable plant? Plants that don't have all of those characteristics I just talked about. So just as a reminder, if they have a lot of volatile substances, if they produce a lot of dead material within the plant or a lot of litter, you want to avoid them. And some of the native species, chamise, California buckwheat, these should not be planted close to your home. They're fine out in the wildlands where they are, but you want to avoid them close to your home. Red shanks as well. But then some of the exotics that can be really bad, pampas grass, fountain grasses, they produce a lot of litter, and they really just go up like a little candle. Italian cypresses, people love to plant those like right under their eaves, worst possible place. Some of the palms, eucalyptus as well. Okay, so you've got your plants there. What do you need to do? You need to remove the dead material in branches. Hand pruning can be a lot better than trying to go in with equipment because you just tend to be a little more careful when you do it by hand. If you go in and you just hedge and shear, you're not going to have the healthiest plant. And healthy plants that are sort of inherently fire resistant, if they're healthy, they're going to be even more fire resistant. And for a lot of the things that are slow growing, like this manzanita, once you prune it into the after condition, you're not going to need to do this every single year. Mulch. You can use mulches. You don't want them too deep, maximum of 6 inches. You can do 3 to 4 inches. You can use that, you can use some of the materials you just removed for fire-safe landscaping, just mulch on site and spread that stuff around. Closer to the home, you might want to consider using gravels, and they come in a lot of different pretty colors. You can do all kinds of things with them. And one thing to note is rubber mulches. I think these are more used kind of in public property areas than at home. They can be really flammable. And this is another thing to keep in mind with building materials too. Non-wood doesn't necessarily mean better. Petroleum products especially. That's what we use to burn when we want things to burn. So think about that. And one of the nice things about mulch is it maintains that soil moisture, it maintains cooler soils, and it keeps the weeds down. Irrigation. You're probably going to want to have some irrigation within your defensible space, especially in that zone really close to the home. Even if you're using plants that do well with little water, you're going to need to water sometimes. Maybe, in the best situation, maybe 2 to 3 times during the dry season. You don't want to water more than needed. Again, if you kill the plant, it's fuel. Water deeply. That can be great to promote that deep root growth. That again will hold the soil. There's a lot of different kinds of irrigation systems that you might want to use depending on what you have. I'm not somebody who thinks that drip irrigation is always absolutely consistently the best. And there's some native plants that actually do better with an overhead spray because that's how they're used to getting soil. So drip systems can be great. You do need to watch out for if you overwater with drip, you can get fungal growths and rot. So think about that. Also, but drip can be great, and it will conserve a lot of water. It is prone to wildlife damage. So if you have a drip system, you need to inspect it. Again, back to this theme of maintenance. And you don't want to rely on irrigating during a fire. Okay, even in the dry season, there's probably going to be watering restrictions, but during a fire, everybody's going to be using that water, including firefighters. There's not going to be any pressure. Plus, if you aren't there, it's not going to help you at all. So you can have, people have irrigation systems actually on the structures themselves. You can have that, but don't rely on it. Don't let it be a crutch to avoid doing some of these other things. Hardscaping, you can use ignition-resistant materials, essentially inflammable stuff, stone, gravel, concrete, metal, and there's a lot of attractive things that you can use. One thing that's in the farthest picture there, you can get sort of wood look concrete if you're looking for sort of a more natural look to things. And if you do use something like a trellis or an arbor, and you're going to have plant material growing on it, that needs to be far away from the house. Okay, so here's just some examples of some fire-safe landscapes. This is kind of one extreme, using terracotta pots and really a lot of hardscape, but this is certainly going to be a fire-resistant situation. This is getting at least a little more into the ground too, but using gravel to kind of break up these planting bed areas. And this is actually really, really dense. Now, there's a lawn closer to the home. You're looking out from the home here. And then they've chosen some low-growing species to really hang on to that hillside. Okay, so just a few before and after pictures. Essentially, you're trying to go from, again, this dense vegetation and a lot of fuel ladders and a lot of continuity of fuels to getting rid of that continuity, breaking it up. And these are just some pictures from some projects in the Santa Monica Mountains. So in this picture, they've really focused on limbing up the trees and pruning. This, again, just kind of thinning out in the area. It's kind of hard to see these pictures with this much light, but you can see that they've just removed a lot of materials. And here they've really cut things back and limbed up and removed all of the dead growth. And one more. You don't want the picture on the left. And driving around Topanga today, there's a lot of that picture on the left. You really need to, what they've done here is they've removed some of the eucalyptus trees completely, and they've thinned out a lot of the pines and just brought everything down and separated it out. And that's it. So, you guys have any questions?
I have a question about hated star thistle, which is on so many of the trails I hike, and it's public land, and a lot of it's parkland. Mm-hmm. What can we do about it?
Star thistle is a tough one. I think in most cases they try to mow it and then use chemical control methods. It's really difficult to try to attack that by hand. So support your land management agencies when they try to find money to do weed control projects.
So what about if it's a trail you hike? Can you just like take clippers and clip as you hike by? And I've done it. And I'm ready to start again.
Now, one thing that's really neat that you can do is you can call them and report it, but there's actually a cell phone app that you can download. There's an Android version and an iPhone version called What's Invasive, and it uses the built-in GPS and the camera on your phone. You sign up for it, and then you go out and you take a picture and track that location, and that's going to automatically get sent to the the land management agencies that are partners in that. So I know National Park Service is, but I encourage, if you're interested in doing that, I encourage you to download that app, and that'll send that information on to the parks agencies. What about lawns? They do take a lot of water. Certain kinds of turf take less water than others. And again, this is something Cooperative Extension, we've got some resources on. Personally, being not the turf advisor in Cooperative Extension, but the sort of natural resources person, I would say you might want to think about limiting lawns to the areas where you need them. You know, because they do have some good features if you've got children playing and dogs running around and that kind of thing.
But are they fire safe?
If well maintained, yeah. Yes, and if they're mown and they're alive, you know, even if they're dead, they're not going to be the worst. If they get to be, if you're using grasses that can grow really high and then those aren't maintained, that's going to be a problem. But your typical, you know, lawn mix of Kentucky blue and crabgrass is fairly fire resistant.
I was interested to learn that some of the palms are a problem, but evidently not all.
You know, palms, it seems like most palm species can be problematic. So there's one palm that's actually native to Southern California, but all of the palms, if you don't remove the dead fronds, and that's really the problem. The problem is those dead fronds do catch on fire really easily, and then we've all seen, you know, windstorms without fires. There's just palm fronds everywhere. Well, think about if those palm fronds were on fire. Then you've got this nice heavy thing that flies through the air really, really well and is on fire. So I'm personally not a huge fan of palms, but if you have them, make sure that you get rid of those dead fronds.
So if there are no dead fronds and they're spaced like 15 feet apart?
Yeah. If fire department want to add anything to that, but I would say, yeah, I mean, it's really about the dead fronds.
I know you're talking about individual homes, but what about, since we all back up to state lands and such, control burns as a maintenance for landscape?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that using fire to try to, say, emulate a natural fire regime doesn't really make a lot of sense in Southern California grasslands and shrublands. Using fire to try to create a specific fuel break is usually done because it's the easiest, cheapest option. It should only be done under appropriate conditions, and if you're concerned about it, I'd contact those land management agencies. They're not going to be burning unless they're back burning during an actual fire event. They're not going to be burning to create fuel breaks during high fire risk conditions, but you know, there have been cases where controlled burns have gotten out of control. So I'm not speaking for them at this moment. So if anyone else would like to take that on, please do. But yeah.
Sorry, it's a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.